if there's a need and a rush. Okay, we'll start, comrades and friends. Cool. Well, hello everyone. It's great to see you all here. My name's Rachel Evans and I'm the organiser of Sydney Socialist Alliance, and I'll be the chair for tonight's forum. We're on the beautiful land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. This land was never ceded, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. Budjagari Gamarawura is welcome in Gadigal. So Budjagari Gamawaru to the Green Left Socialist Alliance Forum after the federal elections, where to for climate action, workers' rights and social justice. Now, Green Left is, comrade, just that way. Awesome. No worries. Oh, good, all good. Have a seat over there. Thanks, Tech. Now, Green Left is recording this forum on our YouTube channel, so please share it on your socials and let us know if you want it switched off if you ask a question. Well, who didn't wake up last Sunday with an extra spring in your step? My local birds were singing sweeter, and my coffee had an extra bazing. Many people so much happier that the mood for change, a teal and green slide defeated Scott Morrison and the Liberal Party's decade of conservative rule. Sick of corporate parties, people turned strongly against the Liberal Party, and despite its big win in seats and two-party preferred, Labor's first preference vote was down as people turned towards the Greens and independents. There was a record 1 in 3 Australians voting for minor parties or independents. And so now we have the lower house of the federal parliament having at least 16 independents or teals and or Greens. The Greens now have 12 senators in the Senate, making it imperative for the Labor government to either negotiate with the Greens or rely on support from the coalition to pass legislation. And across the country, the anti-capitalist socialist vote has risen slightly. Socialist Alliance stood in 4 states, and our Senate vote across these states is now nearly 22,000. Pat O'Shane won 4.3% in the local seat of Leichhardt in Cairns. Andrew Chuter doubled the socialist vote from the last Sydney federal election campaign. And in the seat of Wills in Melbourne's north, the combined socialist vote was 7%. But capitalism's voracious greed won't be abated with a progressive electoral outcome. And our balance of power really is on the streets. So tonight we have movement leaders to fill us in on key steps for workers' rights, for trans rights, public housing, the environment and the cost of living campaigns. And on the back of the WA state ALP government agreeing to a massive gas project off the coast in Western Australia, the Scarborough Hub, criminally turning back a boat of refugees and sending a wage rise claim to the Anti-Worker Fair Work Commission, we clearly need to re-energise our movements. So first up, we're going to have Skip Blofield from the New South Wales Nurses and Midwives Federation and Industrial Wobblies of the World in Sydney. Then we'll have Charlie Murphy, Pride and Protest and Scarlet Alliance, and also Black Flag Sydney. And then we'll hear from Paul Keating, who is Maritime Union of Australia Sydney branch secretary, and he is also the Communist Party Central Committee. And then we'll hear from Andrew Chuter, the National Tertiary Education member, Friends of Erskineville President, and a seat of Sydney candidate for Socialist Alliance in the 2022 federal elections. So to all the speakers, I'll give you a reminder for 2 minutes to go for the 10 in total at 8 minutes, and a wind up at the 10 minutes. And for each comrade then, we'll speak for 10 minutes and we'll go to the floor for questions and comments. And for people in the room, toilets are around the corner, and please do turn off your phones for the meeting. If you do need to take a call, please go down to the hallway because the sound carries. Now, we're mindful as well that COVID is still around, as is the flu. So if you are not wearing a mask, please do. And there are masks at the front if you don't have one. Now, without further ado, let's welcome Skip.
Good evening. Thank you to the Green Left and Socialist Alliance for having me speak here. So the first thing I want to quickly say is that I want to remind everyone that whatever the outcome of this federal election was going to be, that government did not have any mandate. The new regime of the federal Commonwealth simply inherited an illegal occupation of ancient sovereignties which are yet to be ceded. I'd also like to acknowledge kind of the background of this election. So this election saw a wave of protest and industrial movement. It's actually kind of really awesome to see. I've loved to see, like, over the last few years, key actions by the CFMEU, the RBTU, the Teachers Federation, Nurses and Midwives Association, the Health Services Union, the NTEU. Great work at USID, and kind of like give a reason why all this sort of movement is kind of happening, because as Rachel did point out, we've kind of gotten used to it, but we do have this pandemic. This is a huge pandemic that had rocked the world and had brought the global capitalist order to its knees. As a result, wage growth absolutely stagnated. It wasn't going great before, and now it's like capped at this point. Yeah, like legally capped. There was one instance where there was a headline talking about there was $26 billion missing from the lost in the Australian GDP. But also, people also did note that the top 200 largest firms also made about that much more in that same year. So people are getting the idea that the system isn't broken, it's working as it's supposed to for the ruling class. And even during a crisis, it will continue to do so. However, we saw in the last federal election, generally a rejection of this of reactionary rhetoric, whether it be Scott Morrison being Scott Morrison, or it was the anti-woke Albanese that we saw. For their efforts, they were largely swung against. Labor by the Greens, and then a lot of blue seats are eaten up by Teals, who are economically common sense aesthetic progressives, which, it's something. It's an indicator. And I think this indicator should be a means for both short-term wins and for a longer-term strategy. The short-term wins, especially from my point of view, and a lot of the public sector unions, will be essentially using this to signal to the state government, especially the opposition, that the whole anti-progressive sort of stint is not a guarantee, nowhere near. So distancing yourselves from union demands is not going to help you. Chris Minns, for example, had backed the anti-protest laws. He has rejected key demands from the unions, including Nurses and Midwives Association, who still pushes for safe ratios between nurses and patients. And something the association has kind of learnt from this. If you recall last state election, they endorsed the Labor Party. They even put out how to vote cards, got members to put out how to vote cards. On the federal level, they even said, hey, this is something for the aged care sector. We'll at least show support for you. But on the state level, the association is starting to learn that just backing the ALP is not enough. We tried the electoral route last time and it did not work. It failed us and it failed our members. What we have to do is simply go for power and bully whoever is in power into conceding to our demands. Now, is it a lot easier to do that under one party than the other? Yeah, the return of Medicare did show that. However, it's something that like a lot of the members are saying, like when they were disappointed by Chris Minns, where the Animal Justice Party and the Greens did support nursing ratios, and Labor did not. So why is it important for us to be very active in signaling this? It's because we can't just rely that Chris Minns is clever and will just see the writing on the wall. He won't. In fact, we also know that Albanese's really, 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 really shit. And probably the electorate will respond to this. They'll be like, oh, look, we put Labor in power on the federal level, and he's like gone back on promises. He's still, we're still living like paycheck to paycheck. And essentially they'll be like, oh, well, Labor on the state level will do the same thing. So we have to be very sure to signal to the Labor Party and also to the when we do get these possessions, we need aggressive change, actual change, not just rhetoric and not just reactionary tokens to try and buy off an increasingly narrow vote. So another thing to kind of keep in mind on like a larger level, it's kind of like how the ALP will react on a federal level in this sort of environment. So they've only just narrowly got their majority. They did get it. I think it would have been funny in a sort of way if they didn't, but hey, largely they'll still have to negotiate with the crossbench. That's a lot of Greens who, for the most part, I trust a lot more. And for a lot of these Teals. So these Teals largely came from blue seats, and although they are less like explicitly bigoted, for example, there's not much indication that they won't concede a lot of these points for, say, a tax cut for the demographic in their electorate. So something we need to also do is keep in mind that Labor may just as well try to sweep up support from these Teals voters as they would from the Greens. And I think we have to be very mindful of this. And also, again, as I recommend doing on the state level, bully Labor on a federal level, both with industrial action and with direct demonstrations on the streets. So yeah, just to give an indication on like areas where Labor is kind of being just liberal light. So Labor still is talking about the Religious Freedoms Bill, which is an absolute shame. Like sexual and gender minorities are already persecuted plenty enough. They don't need a nod from the state to do so under the ruse of religious freedoms. And why I call it a ruse is because many of the people who say it's about religious freedoms have also, persecuted a religious minorities such as Muslim women for publicly expressing their religion. This is all about, oppressing these minorities. And I've already spoken about other things such as like ratios, the protest laws, and very importantly, I think is also incredible failure to really put anything hard when it comes to climate change and the ecological crisis that faces us. Something that also happened over the last couple of years is we kind of kicked this all off with a massive fire near the end of 2019. And if you count fauna in the death rate, that was 500 million lives lost. It was massive. By a surface area, we're not quite sure we have the geographic evidence that we've seen this in this epoch. And I think that it's very important that for these reasons that we push very, very hard on the Labor Party, because though it's easier to bully them, we shouldn't think of it as they're going to do our work for us. We're going to have to force them to do the good work.
Thank you, Skip. Thanks very much, Skip. We're going to go to... We'll go next to Charlie, and Paul will be next. Take it away.
Cool. Thank you. Thank you to Green Left and Socialist Alliance for having me here today. And I would also like to acknowledge that we're on Gadigal land and that sovereignty was never ceded. My name's Charlie. I'm from a group called Pride and Protest, which is a queer rights group, as well as being a member of Scarlet Alliance. which is the national body for sex workers. I want to start with a little bit of a kind of, I guess, a little post-mortem on how, queer rights was discussed in the election, how it was used by the major parties and whether they were successful in their weaponization of it. So obviously before the election, Scott Morrison was trying his hardest to pass the religious discrimination bill. It was only sunk when a single amendment was passed, and then they refused to put it to the upper house because they didn't want the bill to go through if trans kids were not allowed to be expelled from school. So, saved by the Liberal Party's transphobia in that regard, I guess. But what effect that had on the election was that Scott Morrison made it very clear he wanted to use transphobia to incite a culture war to win votes. Anthony Albanese was wedged by this, and when questioned by the Murdoch media or the mainstream TV channels, he would say transphobic things or parrot, turf talking points, that kind of thing. So very much distancing himself from queer rights. Scott Morrison ran Catherine Dees in the seat of Warringah against Zali Steggall, and by the end of the campaign was directly running her campaign out of his office. She ran on a platform of getting trans women out of sport, and said things like that speaking against trans activists was akin to speaking out against the Nazis, and she was persecuted for doing so. Anthony Albanese took his, distancing himself from queer rights or being, subtly transphobic as a small target strategy to try to win votes in Western Sydney that were in no voting electorates. The outcome for this strategy for both of this party was, I think it's safe to say, a massive failure. So in the seat of Warringah, the Liberals saw a swing against them. In Western Sydney, in those places where they wanted to exploit, transphobia and no voting electorates, and they either lost seats or there was no meaningful change. I think that we should all take away from what happened in this election is that obviously masses of people support queer rights, and it is not a vote winner either for the Liberals or especially for the Labor Party. The question is, will Labor learn their lesson from that? That remains yet to be seen, but there are some indications of what might happen. During the election campaign, Anthony Albanese said that he did want to bring the Religious Freedoms Bill back, his own version of it that would have LGBTQI exceptions in the bill for what Labor would propose. What those exceptions are, we don't know. We do know that the way that they voted when the Liberals had put up their bill is that they supported amendments to protect students, but they didn't actually support amendments to protect teachers and workers for being fired on this basis. Yet another betrayal from the Labor Party for working class people, but that's what they did when the bill was put up that time. The question now is, will Anthony Albanese be keen to bring it back in this Senate, which has more Teals and more Greens in it? The Greens will be hostile to anything that will be negative towards LGBTQI rights. And because the Teals kind of got a big platform with Zali running against Catherine Dees, it may be likely that the Teals will try to pivot to being kind of right-wing protectors of LGBTQI rights. So what will happen with the Religious Freedoms Bill is yet to be seen, and Labor might be putting it on the back burner after both parties got so bruised by being transphobic in the federal election. I think that puts forward for us for queer rights activists, us in a unique spot because we can stop playing defense that we've basically been playing since the Yes campaign and go forward with a really positive set of demands of what we want to see change in the future. For many of those things for queer rights, that's a lot of that is state-based. And the election of the Teals federally is actually kind of a foreshadowing of what might happen here in New South Wales, because they've said that they want to run in New South Wales seats. And currently, who would be considered a Teal, Alex Greenwich, who is the New South Wales member for suburbs around Darlinghurst and is a gay man himself, has said that he wants to put forward a equality bill in time for World Pride next year that is going to end discrimination for LGBTQI people. That's quite an ambitious claim that he's making there, especially when we know that liberation does not stop at our legal rights. But some of the things that he's talked about in that bill are things like changes to birth certificate laws for transgender people, things like anti-discrimination protections for sex workers. This stuff is all good, and I think we would want to see it pass. But the problem with these independent bills is often a lot of the time they're used to horse trade to be in a minority government governing with the Liberals. I think we have to be really clear when this comes up, and this is going to have to be our job to argue going forward, is that we're not going to accept some of our rights being traded away while putting the Liberals into power. And I think we have to make that especially clear for the Teals when I think they're going to come in and be emboldened to try to occupy some progressive political spaces. I think what we need to do in order to do that is make a really clear connection between the workers' struggle and the queer rights struggle. Over the past 2 weeks, I've been on the picket line down at University of Sydney as a supporter. And one of the claims that the NTU members of the University of Sydney had made for their EBA is 6 weeks of paid transition leave every year. So transition leave is time that a trans person can take off of work paid so that they have the ability to take any kind of medical or social or legal procedure that they might need in order for them to transition. We know that trans people are so not often in positions of employment. There is a shocking amount of trans people who are on welfare. So to have rights in workplaces that say that they can transition and they're not going to be at a material disadvantage of that is so important. I think this NTU claim is one of the most comprehensive union claim for trans workers in the country, basically. And to see them win and to see it be put into other industries, I think will make. I think it will be a historic win for trans rights by the NTU. So all solidarity for those comrades there. And so yeah, I think that what we have to do going forward is to say that we're not going to accept some piecemeal reforms of our rights if they're coming at the expense of supporting a Liberal government in New South Wales, and to be there together on the picket lines next to each other, because when we're fighting for workers' rights, we're fighting for trans rights, we're fighting for Aboriginal rights, we're all in it together. So that's.
Thank you, Charlie. Charlie. Thanks very much. We're going to go to Andrew and go, bit of a wipe. And Andrew, you've got PowerPoint and Duncan on chat. If you could go check the Paul Keating on Zoom.
Okay, yeah, I'd also like to acknowledge that we're on Gadigal land and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So I kind of got 4 just headings to cover like the election result itself, geography and demography, public transport and public housing, and ways to campaign and moving forward. So my perception of just the media presentation of the election was it was really just kind of cheerleading, even in the ABC, to the coalition, and issues largely weren't discussed in any depth or detail. I think it's interesting, the ACTU campaign this time. It didn't seem to be as what was the slogan? You remember, of course, your rights at work and change the rules. But the slogan this time was just the pictures of Morrison with the lei on his head going, not my job and don't hold a hose. So it really wasn't a strong sort of pro-worker agenda that was there from the ACTU. But on the other side, there was all these great strikes. And I really do think that, or at least I felt it in New South Wales with the teachers, the nurses, the RTBU, aged care, and my own union, the NTEU. We were all really having a rolling strikes, and that sort of raised the consciousness of a lot of people, I think. So I think that sort of nullified that effect and actually was a very positive sort of thing. So the election result came out, and of course the major party vote collapsed. And I'm a maths teacher, so I typed in all the stats for the last 30 years and came up with this graph. Just a thought I want to discuss. If you can't see that, maybe you'd like to pass that around. It's just a copy of it, right? So what I think is really interesting is, well, everyone's talking about, aren't they, the collapse of the major two-party vote. So the red and the blue lines represent Labor and Liberal respectively in the middle there, and you can see it's going down over the last 30 years. That covers about 30 years since like the middle sort of Hawke era. And the light purple line at the top is the sum of those two. Okay, so yeah, you can see the total of those two is decreasing down. So now we're at 69% of people putting their first preference for a major party. But what is really still shocking and a big problem is the disproportionality of the number of seats that they end up with as a result of that low thing. So the dark purple line represents the total number of seats that they won out of as a percentage, right? So if it was fair, that dark purple line would be on top of the light purple line. But you can see that dark purple line is well above the light purple line. So they're getting 89% of the seats on only 69% of the vote. And of course, you all know this. I'm going to say a couple of facts to you, but you probably haven't processed it in this way. Labor got a majority of seats. We all know that. But we all know they only got a third of the votes. So how disproportionate is that, right? And that gap there is quite wide at the moment. But as you can see, down the bottom there, the light green vote is the vote for all other parties, and the dark green line is the actual number of seats. So unfortunately, even though 31% of people voted for another party, only 11% of those actually reflected in the actual makeup of the House of Representatives. So that's highly disproportional. But as you can see, what I think you'll see is if you can get those blue, especially the blue line, if we can get the blue line down a bit further, and the light green line and up a bit higher, well, then that's going to flip a lot. And we could end up with a much more proportional system if those major two parties slip just any further below the green line. If they slip down below that, then we can go to a really multi-party sort of system, somewhat like I think you see in Northern European countries. Now, I think the most exciting thing that was said, I went through all the election coverage on I recorded it and watched it later. So I punished myself. So I did this all for you to pick out the most beautiful nugget that was said during the night. It was said by Simon Birmingham at 8:51 p.m. And he said, It's a clear problem that we are losing heartland seats that have defined the Liberal Party for generations, and forming government in the future without winning those sorts of seats is a next to impossible task. I mean, that's straight from the horse's mouth now, and that's really kind of interesting. So, although we don't really know exactly how the Teals are going to turn out, I think in the absence of really, we haven't been here before we've never been here before, right? So people could be all cynical and like, oh, those guys are really bad, it's not going to turn out well. But I think as socialists, you know, we have that Gramsci sort of pessimism of the mind and optimism of the will, and we sort of say, well, let's be hopeful. Let's hope. Let's keep pushing. We'll get some of those lines going down and the others going up in the next couple of election cycles, and we could really change. Now, if that's going to get us all the way to socialism, right? It just might get us to, you know, if we keep pushing in this direction for another 6 years, we could get to a kind of Northern European sort of Scandinavian social democracy, perhaps, you know, if we keep doing this. But, you know, like that would be a big step forward for Australia. So I think we're going to see a lot of fragmentation and geographic concentration of effort, because Labor can only get that sort of those seats it has if it gets all its effort on that. And the Liberals will get all their effort focused on their bunch of seats, and the Teals get focused on what they can get, and the Greens focus on what they can get. So it'll be a lot of fragmentation. There's a risk there, I think, in one sense, because you know, I view sort of like the essential class problem. It's the people who work for a living versus the people who profit for a living. And that ratio is 99-1 kind of thing, right? So if we fragment into all these different groups, we've still got to keep in mind that, you know, it's us against them type sort of stuff. You know, it's not just lots of little things. So I feel it's like it's the rainbow versus the blues. We've got to be keeping that sort of in mind versus the Liberals, you know. And you heard a lot on that election night, phrases like inner urban, suburban, outer urban, provincial, rural. I even heard Simon Birmingham say the phrase peri-urban, like people way out sort of on the fringes of not even the metropolitan area, but, you know, commute in. And, you know, those have all got different sort of voting patterns. And, you know, we've got to think about how those people think depending on their area. So I think but definitely what's going to happen in the next 3 years, climate is going to keep getting worse. And climate, even if everybody stopped all their emissions right now, there's a certain thermal inertia in the system that would carry on for decades and decades. We're going to 100 years probably of locked in heating still yet to go. So climate's going to get worse. The cost of living is going to get worse, especially housing. I can only see one of the major issues getting better, and that might be with ICAC. You know, if that gets a federal sort of thing, that might be something that gets better. So all those other things, the reasons that cause this electoral sort of landslide, a lot of them are going to continue and going to get worse. So given all that fragmentation, the geographic aspects, you know, I really believe, and the experience from what we saw, the Greens and John O'Shree, the style of campaigning up in Brisbane is, you know, I think a lot of focus, we can benefit a lot from focusing on public transport and public housing. We can make all these great changes in our cities, but housing's going to keep getting more expensive and more gentrified unless we focus on public housing. And public housing in centrally located areas is a strong way to reduce the carbon emissions of our cities. And this is discussed in, you know, a lot of detail, like Mark Diesendorf from UNSW writes in his book, you know, automobile-dependent cities rely on cars to the virtual exclusion of environmentally sounder modes such as public transport, cycling and walking. One of the characteristics of such a city is its low population density and its tendency to sprawl over a large area. One of the social consequences of urban sprawl is the isolation of low-income earners in outer suburbs with few facilities. In the inner suburbs of automobile-dependent cities, major roads divide communities and provide a hazardous environment for young children, so dangerous that nowadays many parents drive their children to school. Roads, traffic and parking take over public open spaces either directly or by making them unpleasant through noise and air pollution. and people know me, I'm a really big passionate supporter of public and active sort of transport. So I think a lot of those sort of campaigns in targeted areas could really keep increasing the progressive voices. I've been speaking for over 10 minutes now, but I think we can make a more livable city, which in doing that would make us more social and more socialist. And post-COVID, we've got to focus on keeping those things that actually we learnt about, like the separated cycle lanes, the walking, free public transport, and things like that. We're going to hold on to those and reject the bad things that came out of COVID, like increasing casualisation. Moving forward, I think that, and I've got a few sort of slides of some of the campaigns that I've been involved in before. We've got the 2023 next year, the state election. We've really got to kick out this state government. Now, I was really involved in doing my best to try to kick it out 3 years ago. Unfortunately, didn't succeed. But through the No West Connects campaign and then moving into Fix New South Wales Transport and then Fix New South Wales, we managed to get together a massive coalition of campaigners. Actually, we got together endorsements from 73 community groups. I'm talking people like campaigning against cruise ships, incinerators, dams, the Western Sydney Airport, and deaths in custody, TAFE, Save the Powerhouse, people campaigning against the tolls in Western Sydney. I do with those campaigns, plus adding on public housing. We've been getting so successful on the public housing in Waterloo. We managed to get 2,700 signatures opposed to the Waterloo South redevelopment. We've managed to get more public housing in Cowper Street. We managed to get them to cancel the Explorer Street redevelopment. They've deleted Communities Plus, the neoliberal sort of model for public housing, from the website. We've now got inclusionary zoning. We've got other campaigns coming forward about building new public housing at 600 Elizabeth Street, Redfern, which is currently vacant, and a campaign on maintenance. I really do think with that, combined with a lot of these other public transport and urban sort of improvement sort of campaigns, we can build up a real grassroots thing in targeted sort of areas. And the one place I think that perhaps we could campaign is in summer streets. Now, this is a new, we saw these summer streets in Surrey Hills and Redfern and Glebe, the sort of street festivals to re-enliven the areas. They're not just like a Vivid where you go and see some lights. They're places where you might just go and hang out for a while. And I reckon we could set up stalls in those sort of places and gradually building up and moving towards a big anti-Perrottet protest in mid-February 2023. That's what I'd like to see. I'm interested in everybody else's thoughts on, how we can, where should we go in the next sort of 9 months or so. Yeah.
Thanks heaps, Andrew. Thanks heaps. We've got Paul Keating online. So we'll go to Paul. G'day, Paul. How you going?
G'day, comrade. How are you?
Excellent, excellent. Look, comrade, take it away. We've had our 3 speakers and you're our final. And you've got 10 minutes and we'll enjoy it. Go forth.
Well, it's always very difficult for me to speak or get everything through in 10 minutes, but I'll do my best. What do we do post this election? Well, there's a lot of work for the Labor movement to come together so as to change the fortune of organised labour in this country. And that will, in my view, come about with not just campaigning, but a fight. We live in an advanced capitalist society, and the industrial laws in this country are certainly some of the most anti-union, anti-worker that we see across the world. And I say that given the work that we, as a union, the MUA does. I've just come back from the US. We had an international conference of dockers, The Dockers movement is growing and getting better organised. And I sit on the permanent commission as the Oceanic representative under the International Dockers Council. And we hear the stories of workers right across the world and the brutal nature of the state and the employers against dockers and their unions. But a prime example, if we look at the US, for instance, there are two, dockers unions, one on the East Coast, one on the West. And they have a complete control of the labour. Dockers in America and Canada don't work for an employer. They get picked up on a daily basis through their hiring hall, their union hall. That was hard fought decades earlier. Now, if we had a system like that in Australia, where we fought and established the control and organised structure of labour on the waterfront, we have under the ACCC the powers and also criminal law that classifies that as cartel behaviour, criminal cartel behaviour. But that shouldn't deter us. It's how we move forward. I'll just speak briefly on how militant leaders and organisers and I think workers more broadly in general see what changes need to be made to the Fair Work Act. And quite frankly, there's nothing fair in it. The ABCC and the ROC must be abolished. It's as simple as that. You want to know about anti-democratic laws, construction workers, and that includes, those workers right across a number of unions. Obviously, the construction division of the CFMMEU, which, is the union I belong to, the ETU and the Australian Manufacturing Workers Union. If workers are brought in front of that commission, whether they're officials, organisers or rank and file workers, they have no right to representation. It is a closed court. They are compelled to answer the questions or they will be put in jail. That's what that law is. We mightn't be getting shot, but those laws are to not just intimidate, but terrify the working class. The ROC, Registered Organisations Commission, that must be abolished as well. And I'm pretty sure, I'm confident the Labor movement will stop at nothing until which time we will continue to campaign to make sure that those two organisations abolished. The ALP have put forward the position on their policy platform going into the election that they're going to abolish them. I might add, when it comes to major parties, and the Greens move into that space after this election as a force, a political force that cannot be denied, they have the best industrial relations policy. And certainly it's a policy that the MUA and certainly other unions will be supporting. That's very important. But on the industrial relations, equal pay must be a campaign that we do not stop until we deliver it. And now's the time. From this last election, there is a political change amongst people, not organised enough yet, but the Labor movement must be at the forefront in that. The right to decent pay rises, industrial bargaining across the industries that workers work in and unions represent. So industry bargaining. Gone are the days, and I've made it a point to speak to our members over a number of years. Enterprise bargaining always had a use-by date. We've seen that when militant unions have defied the rules that were set out in relation to what enterprise bargaining was to be established for, and we've gone beyond those boundaries. The MUA, as an example, have redefined a whole host of things, but the resources that are used, the significant industrial action and struggle that the rank and file must engage in to achieve that is unacceptable. These are crimes against the working class and organised labour. And now's the time that we continue on a path that must be more radical industrially, more radically politically, if we're going to bring about dignity and respect for workers in our communities. Industry bargaining is a must. Women-dominated industries, pay rights. We're not going to stand any longer. The fact that in these industries women are paid significantly less is again a crime against the working class. And now's the time, after what we have seen with this election, that there is the ability for organised labour, as well as in line with the working class, to establish a strong platform. And that means that we must campaign. And campaign means we must get out on the streets. Aged care workers is a prime example. We've seen the Royal Commission into aged care and the criminal nature of, a privatised system on aged care and the most vulnerable, or some of the most vulnerable people in our society, and the sheer exploitation on the workers that look after them. I think that they are key in the industrial relations space that the labour movement must now focus on. I know our union will be moving towards a whole range of other aspects to the industrial relations laws. I might add, the federal right of entry permits for union officials and organisers are absolutely outrageous. We must abolish it altogether, the permit system. Workers elect their officials, and those officials should be given the democratic freedom to represent their members, full stop. In the union I belong to, the CFMMEU, there are a whole host of organisers and trade union officials that don't have permits because the Industrial Commission will not grant them, myself included. That will not stop myself or any other official of our union representing our members. But now's the time to be on the front foot. And there is a list, and it's a big list in regards to what's rotten in the industrial relations space. When it comes to what the union has been working strategically with other unions on, offshore wind is a prime example. And what comes with that is the transition with communities that will be most affected. We have set out a white paper, a very well structured platform with unions like the ETU, especially the construction division of our union, the MUA, the AMWU and others, and set out a program whereby it is clear that this is an energy source that will set the development and the future of this country, and also the responsibilities that we have globally to the people of this world in place. Very important. The science is there. We have seen the control and cynical approach to moving to the changes that are needed for our country and the people of the world in order for any chance of the planet having any survival. And offshore wind is a source that will put us into a very strong place, like green hydrogen. The development of these industries will be crucial in also establishing frameworks that the trade union movement, and our union in particular, strongly advocate. In particular, manufacturing that should be in public ownership. We should take on the capitalist system head on in this space, showing the failure in so many industries. Poor privatisation is a prime example. where we see the absolute gouging of the monopolising of private enterprise taking over ports and with no efficiencies. And we see time and again the monopolising of the selling off of public assets to private enterprise, and the monopolising of that comes back in returns that cost the people in ways that are just outrageous. The union's view around a whole host of components to this post-election, we've argued strongly around the merchant fleet, a strategic merchant fleet. We say that developing the relations and the friendships of our neighbours come through platforms of peace, not war. A strategic merchant fleet will not only advance the interest of the working class in this country, but in the region. And it is strategically very important. We've seen the warmongering of the previous government, the Morrison government, the AUKUS deal and the nuclear subs. The MUA is very strong on this. We oppose it entirely. We oppose this imperialism in this region. We oppose nuclear subs. The cost is so significant. We know that a generation from now, it will only attack our health system, our education system, and the very structures in society that provide dignity of life, including our welfare system. It must be opposed, and we must campaign until we change the shift in the consciousness of the working class. We've seen it before, comrades. We've seen that before. And if I go back to 1938 in this country, when waterside workers refused to load pig iron on the Delphram before the Second World War had unfolded, to make a point that Japanese militarism was a crime against the people of China, and we will not engage. At that time, there was no conscious view amongst the working class on this. It was that dispute that changed the tide of the people in this country, and we can do it again. We've seen it when we mobilise. I know there's only a very short time. I would say very quickly, the Gummeroy campaign opposing Santos. Now's the time that the Labor movement, especially in this state, we have got a united position from Unions New South Wales in a resolution we will continue to pursue. I say to Santos now, we will be taking you on. We stand with the Gummeroy people. It's their country. It's their land. They'll determine sovereignty, and we will fight alongside them. As for the right to protest laws in this state, well, if the state wants to take on the working class, we'll be up for the fight. And there will be those examples like delegations going up to Narrabri, standing alongside the Gummeroy people if Santos thinks that they're going to drill on their country. And with that, I would say there is a movement. It's May Day, the May 1 movement, the MUA and the CFMEU construction division of New South Wales for the last 6 years have stopped their workers working on that day for the last 6 years. For the last 6 years, the Port of Botany has stopped to recognise the struggles of the working class, to galvanise our position, to also commemorate and the fights and the successes, but to consolidate our positions of the day on what we need. So the May 1 movement, I believe, is where we should galvanise our communities around. That's next year, May Day. There's only one day, May 1, the Day of the Workers. Thank you.
Thanks heaps, Paul. Rockin. Look, we're going to open it up for discussion now. And I know there have been a bunch of rallies in Sydney since the elections. And I know friends and comrades have been to them. And if you can relay what's happened, that's good. We've also got comrades very long-term involved in environment movement, campaigning, Stop Adani, Coal Seam Gas, Extinction Rebellion, and other comrades who've been involved, of course, in their union activities. So, yeah, don't be shy. What we'll do is we'll go in a round of 4, and then we'll take it to the panel, and we'll go back to the audience, and we'll take it to the panel. So I'll get Duncan or Isaac to be a mic runner, and I'll check online too.
Got James here, the first question.
Thanks to all the speakers, they're all great. I wanted to ask Paul about the merchant fleet. Is there anywhere one can go to learn more about this this concept so we can start bashing people's ears about it? Thanks.
Thanks, James. So we're doing 4, right, Rachel? Okay. Pip.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment, if you don't mind. Thanks to all the speakers. I think, I guess I feel like it is quite a momentous time we're living in when really the two-party system has had a big biff in the nose. It's not over, as everyone knows, but, you know, I've gone through many election cycles and we ain't seen what we've just seen. And I think we've got to be, while it's good to have a certain amount of cynicism about parliamentary politics, which we all do in this room, we can't be too cynical as to not realise that there are some huge openings here if we get the social and the union movements going. I mean, I feel like there are pluses and minuses. I think some of the big pluses from this election, climate is definitely on the agenda, from eco-socialists to teals, if you like, that broad spectrum. Climate has made its mark. Actually, and not through the vote, but through the high school students, through, you know, everything. The movement, the mass movement that put it on the agenda, I think has been validated in this election campaign. And the myriad of campaigns that comrades are involved in, from gas, anti-coal and all the rest of it. I mean, even the Nationals now, Barnaby Joyce, I heard today or read today that he's claiming to have convinced Morrison of the 2030 target, you know, woohoo, you know. So even the Nationals are climate converts now, if you can believe it. But anyway, I think what it's telling, we don't believe that, but I think climate is, while it's not, you know, those mass movements that we saw from the students, it's not on the streets at the moment for many reasons, the myriad of organising work that went into that has paid a dividend. And that means that the conversation opens, because it's not about targets, it's about what comrades have been saying. It's about, you know, jobs, it's about transition, it's about, you know, how to move on it. Now, so I think this opens up huge opportunities for the social movements and the union movement. The minuses are, and there are a lot of minuses, is that Labor Party very cleverly ran a Me Too campaign and lowered expectations. So its strategy was basically, you know, we'll just be, we agree with them, we agree with them, we agree with them. Oh, we don't quite agree with them, but, you know, calm the mighty union movement, says Anthony Albanese on election night. I mean, really, they ran a campaign to lower expectations, and we are going to see inflation rising, cost of living rising, and we're going to see them already starting to talk about the fact that we're in such a big budget black hole, they've got to reel it in. So where they're going to cut's going to come from. Now, I guess it will be interesting, I think, and we've got to keep an open mind. I agree with Andrew on this. You can't preempt this, but what will the Greens do in government? I mean, you know, it is phenomenal what they managed to achieve in Brisbane, and Green Left is running some of the sort of campaign strategy pieces, which I think is very important we can learn from. But what will they do in government? Will they be keen to be seen as responsible partners, you know, with the Labor Party? Because that's really what the campaign they were running. Adam Band was running, or will they want to be responsible partners to the social movements on the streets, the grassroots campaigns? And I think, you know, like, I think it's an open question at the moment. I think we've got to push them. So the LGBTI community, the anti-coal seam gas community, the union movement and all the rest of it. I noticed Paul's just said, you know, Greens are going to be our partners in this. And I think as if we go into the next period with the idea that it's only going to be the movements on the streets that's going to make the most of the fact that the two-party system has got a big biff on the nose, you know, we might get to, you know, some of the steps where we want to go. So I guess, you know, coming back to this, I think there's huge numbers of openings, and I think we have reason to be erring on the optimistic side. We shouldn't be just thinking, oh, you know, parliamentary elections or bourgeois, blah, 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 you know. I think we've got to be a bit more scientific about how to seize those cracks and try and open them into great big trenches. Thank you.
Anyone else with a question or a comment? I'll just go myself. I was just going to mention one of the other campaigns that I think is going to be important to put the pressure on Labor and to keep building, and it kind of ties into our like public housing and public transport work. Is the kind of dismal rate of welfare payments like job seeker, youth allowance, disability support, pension, and all of these rates are way too low, like way below the poverty line. I think it's $88 a day is the kind of Henderson poverty line that's where the demands are at the moment, and the Greens are supporting that. And I think they've said going into discussions with Labor that would be one of their kind of 6 or 7 points they were pushing. But as we know, it's going to also take pressure outside of Parliament for those wins to actually happen. And it's not just the payment rate, it's also things like the cash income management, the basics card that gets pushed on people, and also things like mutual obligations, kind of getting forced to jump through all these hoops and steps to actually get money to be able to afford food, and housing isn't really a good system. And so, yeah, raising income support tied in with things like public housing and public transport, I think is going to be very important. And like Labor, I think going into the last election said, we're not promising to raise it, but we're going to do a review. And then going into this election, they dropped even the idea of a review. So it's kind of was very disappointing of Labor going into the election, but now I've got to make sure they actually do something and not just like let that sit for another 3 years, because a lot of people can't wait that long. Was there any other questions or comments before we go back to the panel? Anyone online, Rach? No one online. Jim, there you go.
Oh, thanks. Thanks, comrades. That was, I've been sitting downstairs listening to you. So, yeah, that was a really good panel. And greetings to Paul, Comrade Paul there. I thought that was an excellent summary of the industrial situation we face. But I just want to give a brief anecdote. I've just returned from a week in Brisbane, which is called, well, they say there was a green slide in Brisbane. Pretty much true. And they're even calling Queensland Greensland. Now that's probably considering what happened in the rest of the state. Yeah. But having lived in Brisbane, Queensland for a long time, look, it's always been, we can go into this in depth, but it's always been two Queensland.
Hold on, Jim, we can't hear you. No. Oh, yes. I think you can comrades hear me now? Testing 1, 2 in Zoom land. Come and talk to this.
Okay. All right. Look, there's a huge discussion going on in the Brisbane left about the meaning of this 3 seats now gone green. It's definitely the result of a long amount of work, and I do give a big plug for this week Green Left. Make sure you get a copy because it's got an interesting article by Liam Flanardi who's the Greens campaign manager, and it goes into it. But this was no accident. This has been building up. They started with Jonathan Shree in the Brisbane City Council, whatever it was, 5 years ago, based on not just propaganda, but campaigns. And that's what they've done. They've been involved in campaigns. And if anything, sometimes I think rightly have been critical of the Greens in various aspects. They like to show the green triangles at rallies, but they don't necessarily, do all the hard yards in terms of the campaign work. But that being said, I think the lesson of, what I heard in Brisbane talking to people, both Labor people, even Labor people, some of them are sort of thinking, maybe this is going to be the status quo, because they're going to be, these Greens, they're well organised. I don't think they're going to get out of there in a hurry. Maybe the Labor Party has to think themselves, okay, we'll just accept that. That's our left flank. That's actually, anyway, to a large extent, the Greens are a result of a split in the Labor Party anyway. It's really the socialist left of the Labor Party has gone off and left, but that's a historical question. Anyway, very quickly, couple of points. I went to a forum last night by the Workers for Climate Action. It was interesting there because a speaker from the school students for climate, they're getting ready for a big rally later this year. So, the movement is not stopping. The climate movement is not stopping. Also, Bubbly Weatherall was there. They want people to go up to the Gomeroi. I think they're saying in September. I think they're talking about big actions up there around the gas. So the signs are there. And finally, just on Paul's points, I think, what you've said, Paul, is really important. We must learn the lessons of 2008. We cannot drop the ball. The trade union movement must not drop the ball as they did in 2008, where they gave up the momentum from the Your Rights at Work campaign and allowed the Fair Work Commission to get established and so on. The abolition of that and the opening up of union rights in this country is almost like the gateway to the whole movement. If we don't allow the unions to have the right to organise officials to go on the site, for heaven's sake, it undermines everything else. So, yeah, I really strongly support your points on that and also the other comrades. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. We'll go to the panel for some comments and then we'll go back to some questions. Charlie, do you want to start?
Maybe Paul can start with that question about the merchant fleet.
Okay, go for it, Paul, and then we'll go Charlie and along the line. Oh, Paul. Okay. Thanks, Dirk. Okay, we'll go to Charlie along the line.
Yeah, I think the comments on what the Greens will do is a meaningful question to ask. And yeah, I think it's about reminding them what got that popularity them in the first place, because they will fritter it away if they throw away those local campaigns for making deals with the Labor Party. And you're right, it's our job to remind them that making those deals and, becoming like the German Greens, for example, is what's going to be the death of their movement. And yeah, in terms of keeping up the pressure, it is absolutely right. I think we should all feel really enlivened by that. The best time to attack your enemies is when they're weak. So we should do it now and as quickly as possible. I will say that the New South Wales ALP conference is in October, and wouldn't it be great over that conference to see a number of protests, those climate protesters? Wouldn't it great to see the nurses and the teachers there marching on the conference to say we want climate action, to say we want ratios, to say we want real action on LGBTQI rights? There are a lot of opportunities for us, I think. So.
Yes, thank you for everyone's comments. Just responding to Pip, was it? Yep. So I think that the like talking about climate is actually going to be increasingly relevant. So I think I mentioned the devastating floods that are damaging many of our settlements. Floodplains are a excellent place to to start farming and building towns. This historically has looked like a bad idea. And we're seeing increasing comments from the Nationals who are slowly waking up to this. Many of their much of their constituency are also farmers, and they're going to be hit by a lot of these changing climates. But geopolitical issues will also be exacerbated by climate. If I to something using that's a bit topical, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, for example, is it any little wonder that that one of the, I think it's the 5th largest gas fields in the world, threatens a federation who supplies a third of the European Union's fossil fuel imports? Like that in of itself, I would argue, is a climate war. So I think there's a lot of opportunities to really talk about how a lot of these issues that we are facing do require action on climate change. As to what the Greens will do, I don't know. Yes, I think it's actually very important. I joked about bullying the Labor Party. Not above doing that to the Greens either. Reminding the people who call themselves progressive, call themselves lefts, many of them call themselves socialists, reminding them of those values. We have those friends in those spaces. Let's make sure they're actually friends. I forgot your name. Isaac, you're right. Sorry, my brain's full of holes. I drank heavily in high school. Awesome comments about eating away, both eating away at the welfare state and the degradation of our public, public infrastructure. I think one thing to consider about this as well is the Uluru Statement from the Heart discourse is getting mainstream, right? And we know things like the welfare state and public infrastructure disproportionately affects them because they're disproportionately of lower socioeconomic brackets. If Labor does start talking, start getting serious about the Uluru Statement from the Heart and other ideas of treaty or armistice with the First Nations, then their economic policy and their support for things like infrastructure and for welfare and for just social support will also be called in question. Because if you're saying, yeah, we're all for the sovereignty of the First Nations, right? We want to elevate these oppressed people who've been occupied for hundreds of years now. But then they let half of them go homeless because there's horrible support for social housing because they're being eaten up by rapacious private developers. Then it's very easy to point to that hypocrisy, be like, hang on. And then that's when we move. That's where we move. That's where we bully them. That's where we push. That's an example of an opening to push for these changes. And to Jim, yeah, I think another good indication of the progressive swing that we saw in the federal election is the UAP and One Nation's horrible performance. Now, yeah, dude, let's cheer on their failure. Yeah, exactly. Now, not to take away from efforts, they did things that were unsmart, such as telling all their voters to put the sitting minister last, which included a lot of Nationals and Liberals members in some cases, or I think it was One Nation, who, if you followed their how to vote card, it would be an invalid vote. But I also think that like this is not only an indication of the federal swing away from reactionary rhetoric, but I also think it as well a good it speaks to the organization. A lot of these parties are rife in Queensland. This speaks to the organisation of the Queensland left, and very, very much congratulate their success. And I hope they stay strong. And you know what? I'm going to bet on it.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, that's interesting. Talking about the green slide in Brisbane, and those reports in the Green Left are really interesting. And what they did, I mean, they did things like letterbox a booklet almost. I think it was quite long, outlining all the policies to every house in a lot of those electorates. They did a bit of flood relief as well. And a lot of community organising, which so there'd be people just in different areas that go, yeah, I know that those guys are pretty good. They helped out with this, or you know, sometimes I mean, some of the things I've been involved with, just to get an extra pedestrian crossing or get lifts at your local station, and those kind of things can really boost the profile. And one person, like I think is a good example, who's managed to increase her profile incredibly, is Larissa Penn on the North Shore. I mean, admittedly, this is just, you probably just think of her as like a TLS type sort of person, but she's outside of that dynamic, and she's just been, you know, rigorously opposing the Western Harbour Tunnel and Beaches Link toll road, and she came in extraordinarily close to winning Gladys's old seat, and I really would like to see that get over the line. That would be like a bit of a Teal type, or semi, you know, she's perhaps more progressive than that type victory over there. The other thing we didn't talk about was the defeat of Christina Keneally to Dai Lee, and that's a different dynamic to all of the other stuff, isn't it? You know, like just parachuting in your white candidate that doesn't, you know, respect and respond to the locals, you know. So I think there's that southwestern Sydney and ethnic dominated parts of Sydney didn't like that. Labor just perhaps held up their vote in Chinese speaking areas, didn't they? Because they're not so racist fear mongering against China. So there's opportunities there. I was talking to Jake Lynch just at the picket line. And I said, what do you reckon is going to happen? He goes, you really need like some independent person, I'll stand if necessary, he said, in Bankstown or somewhere like that, on a pro-Palestinian sort of front. And that's the one thing I do remember over this last year that was really successful was the BDS, the Sydney Festival sort of thing. And he said, even the Labor sort of Jihad Dibs and all those and other characters, they're not really speaking up about it. You're going to speak up about Palestine, and you'll pick up a lot of support in some of these areas. And so it just goes back to what I'm talking about, is that targeting certain areas on issues, and that's where there could be a big support for that as well. Cruise ships, incinerators, the casinos. So maybe we need what's going to happen to Crown Casino? Like, are they going to open that? And hopefully not. Can't we just go there and protest and say, no, just shut this down. You're never going to open up. And by the way, Star City, get rid of that. Maybe those issues could gel. There will always be something that I reckon over this next 9 months leading into the state election that they'll do something really shit that will just really anger people, like, put racing flags on the Opera House or something like that. We're going to be ready to jump right in and go, man, you guys suck. I really hate that, I just can see Dominic Perrottet going really wrong in some things, and we've got to really be ramping up the pressure, I think, towards the next state election on that.
Thank you. And we'll go to Paul.
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah. My battery died, so sorry about that, comrades. Look, just to the first question that was asked about a strategic shipping fleet. It was a policy or a platform that the ALP was running on. Well, you can get on the MUA side, whoever the comrade was asking, a lot of information around it. But it dates back 9 years it dates back more than 2 decades from the union's perspective, campaigning for cabotage, which is coastal shipping and the laws that protect workers on the coast. For a lot of workers, they'd be unaware that it's called cabotage, that we've had the abuse of what's known as a single voyage permit system used as a weapon against our members. And for more than 2 decades, we've seen the most significant attack on the right to work than any other industry, as we've seen in regards to seafarers on their own coast. So you've got coastal trade between ports around the country being done by exploited workers from other parts of the world on as little as $2 an hour. For the last 9 years, the MUA has campaigned and set up a jobs embassy in Canberra on the lawns of Parliament, during the winter sitting, to bring to the attention of the politicians in Parliament, of all persuasions for that matter, and to some to give them some conscience around the poor policies that they've had in the past, namely the ALP, but to bring about the plight of Australian seagoing industry. The ALP is committed to 12 Australian vessels. It'll be container vessels, it'll be tankers, and some bulk vessels. It's a start, but if you look at countries around the world with their own flagged vessels, I mean, Switzerland, for instance, has more than 200 vessels. It's a landlocked country that's flagged in its and we don't. And we're the 4th largest product of movement of trade in the world. And yet we've got 12 vessels, 11 vessels that are Australian flagged. It's actually criminal, because what the industry provides is significant jobs. It is a strong platform and argument on green industry, because it's far more less carbon impact, and the industry itself is moving to carbon neutral. So there are a whole host of benefits of trade around the coast and the movement of that cargo on Australian vessels for seafarers. I've heard a lot of those things that have just been spoken about. Very briefly, climate action. Obviously, it's the strong voice here in this election has been climate action. Even with the Conservatives, the Teals, we should not, lower our guard. These are Conservatives. These are capitalists, and all they've done is shift a political space because their own political establishment have not been listening to what they are seeking themselves around climate action. And also ICAC. I think it should have been mentioned that a federal ICAC is significant, and it's very important. And the more politicians that are, and from what we can take, and we've got to see where it goes with the ALP. And I agree with the other speakers. The ALP's been a small target. It's been weak. But there is a Greens movement. There's a climate action movement. And I think that there's a base of is growing. A lot of younger people haven't been, don't have this view of, the Murdoch press and media that have demonised socialism. And they're making their own understanding of the world that they live in. They see that the capitalist system isn't working for them. They see that it's born on selfishness and individualism. They see that capitalism is not sustainable and it's destroying the planet. And it's important that movements, the labour movement, as a trade union leader, must be there with all the working class movements for the change that's needed. I'd say this, the great revolutionary James Connolly said this: there are two ruling class parties, one ideology. It stands 100 years since when he said it, no different to today. We have a political class that haven't changed the course. Let's be clear, they haven't changed the course. They believe strongly in the capitalist state. What we're finding is that there are a system that is breaking down in regards to what has been, for a large part of the population, pretty good standards. But we know that the welfare system has been destroyed by both major political parties. They set on the path under the Paul Keating government on this. And the idea that superannuation, I mean, the deal was this back in the day, and I'm actually old enough to remember the space. The deal was with superannuation is that age pensions would keep up with the cost of living. This was the compact. What we know about superannuation is if you're a woman, you're significantly left with a complete injustice of inequality. The system was designed for that as well. If you are male, white, and in industries that are unionised, you're going to do really good. But that's not the population. We have a population of diversity, and half the population, being women, do not have that same deal. The system's broken. Superannuation sold out the welfare system. And it's not just age pensions. It's single parent pensions. It's the dole. It's invalid, disability pensions. The whole system the movement of that's growing in regards to inequality, climate action and all the other groups need to consolidate our positions, draw up our demands and nail it to the bloody wall and start campaigning on that. And it'll only take a grassroots working class movement with all those organisations to change where we need. It's going to be a fight. If you don't bring in laws, anti-protest laws, to criminalise protest activity for no reason, they want to stop us getting out on the streets. A union like ours, the MUA, for instance, we take over, we occupy buildings, we campaign for our communities. We bring it more broader than just the industrial interest of our members or even with the movement. But it's the social and political interest of the working class that we campaign and get out in the streets. And it's important now more than ever. The Greens, well, I think they've got some really good policies and working class people have gravitated to, taxing billionaires, consolidating that value of money, having an expansion on Medicare so that it's universal and free, a better education, free education, higher education, having dental as part of the Medicare system. This appeals to the masses. We need to start bringing that stuff together because the major parties will not sit in that space. The ALP will not. But the shift is undeniable in regards to this last election. I think that we can take opportunities to take advantage of. And that means we can campaign in a space that would, I've got to say, regardless of how the political system operates, whether ALP's got 76 seats, who cares? They got that off the back of a movement, a shift of the people. And that is where, as socialists, it's important that we start consolidating our position. We need more socialists. We need more communist standing. We need to shift that change. We need to bring about not slogans, but the development of policy so that it's understood. Once you control the state, there isn't anything we can't do. You know, we can tax the criminals, the real gangsters in the system. You know, we talk about the gangsters. The real gangsters are the multinationals, are the rich, are the billionaires. They didn't get there without exploiting the people. Call them out for what they are. I call them criminals because they've inflicted poverty on the people. They continue to establish the framework that keeps First Nations peoples in the destructive cycle of discrimination and extortion of the lands that they own, they rightfully have. And the fact is, where they move from here, we need to make sure we're alongside First Nations peoples. I think the Gummeroy campaign and the people are very courageous. What they're redefining is their own sovereignty and land rights. They're not saying we want to go to the Native Title Tribunal. It was set up by white men. The system, that doesn't give power. There's certainly no equal power. They're defining it. And if that means they're putting up blockading the roads, doing whatever they want on their land, we need to be there.
Awesome. Thanks, Paul. Really important discussion and invigorating, energising discussion. We're going to go for another round to the audience, and I noticed that online has been a bit silent, so I'm encouraging onliners to get on. But we've got a couple of hands up, and I just want to also point to comrades. I think it was Andrew who was talking about Fix New South Wales, coalitions. There was ALP State Conference. There's the high school student strike. We've got to get a little bit concrete now. I know there's been some rallies Steffi's been to. Maybe she wants to express. There has been some good actions already, but maybe we do want to propose in a vague but definitive sense that we want to do a few things together and then move in our organisations to make it happen. So we've got comrade up there.
Thanks to all the speakers. I just wanted to flag, I guess, the importance of us staying on our toes with the refugee campaign and looking at how, Labor's behaved within, for the first 24 hours of taking office. We saw the Liberals pre-election try and diffuse the refugee issue going far back as last year when the Billawheeler family were finally allowed into the community. But, only 3 of them were given bridging visas, so they're still hedging their bets both ways by not sort of allowing them to return to Billawheeler. We saw in the final weeks, the New Zealand deal finally being accepted. We saw pretty much most of the last Medivac guys in Park Hotel being released. So, Liberals obviously seeing it as a significant issue they were losing votes on and absolutely desperate to find votes anywhere they could. And yet now we see Labor, in that 24 hours, continuing with the turn back of that boat from Sri Lanka, continuing these enhanced screening processes, that have been thoroughly discredited. We've seen them only give a bridging visa to, Tharunika, the youngest daughter, rather than a permanent protection visa, and still their fate is very much uncertain. And the statement was that it'll be left to immigration, but we knew this was never going to actually help this family when decisions regarding Sri Lankan asylum seekers are made based on a politically biased country report regarding Sri Lanka, which was always, motivated by being able to send asylum seekers back to Sri Lanka, get the Sri Lankan government's cooperation. So there's still a lot to be to fought there. On election night, I was fortunate to spend it with a bunch of Hazara asylum seekers who were understandably overjoyed, considering the last election result that they would have been through exactly this same thing. But, I could see that, people were quite disappointed that Albo didn't actually bring up the refugee issue, considering those men I was sitting in that with the peoples whose lives were most changed by the outcome of this election, that, you know, that the promise of permanent protection visas. But, you know, we need to make sure that though, you know, they follow through on that they're fast tracked to citizenship. You know, they've been separated from their families for 10 years. How many years is it going to take in terms of, you know, getting family reunions happening, all of those things, and all of the other forgotten asylum seekers in the community, people who have had their applications rejected, you know, the Medivac guys who aren't going to be covered by the New Zealand deal. So many questions that still remain unanswered, you know, and Labor obviously wants to continue indefinite detention and things like that. So much to be fought on that campaign that we can't let up on. The other two things I want to mention that that Andrew mentioned that really struck a chord with me, that I think would be great campaigns to continue with. I'm not familiar exactly with what Socialist Alliance has been involved with in terms of public transport particularly, but just, you know, speaking from my own experience coming from the Northern Territory, where public transport is a much more affordable. You know, I know as a worker, I spend nearly $3,000 on public transport a year, and that's something even I feel the pinch of. But, you know, thankfully it means, you know, I haven't had to fill up my car this year, so that there is plus sides to public transport, and we obviously need to continue investing much more. Just in that 2 weeks where we had the free public transport, that there was a patient that talked to me at the Aboriginal Medical Service about how for those 2 weeks, she actually was able to travel all around Sydney, get out on the ferries. Her mental health had been suffering for so long, and she actually had this respite. Other people telling me how they were able to get out, families explore more. People were actually able to come into, you know, this common issue. People can't even afford to go to their medical appointments, you know, because public transport's so expensive. Even if you were to have a concession, you know, card in regards to those things. I'm thinking of when I lived in Liverpool, that there's no fast trains to get you from Liverpool into the city. So a lot of people still choose to drive. And even when you're traveling short distances in Sydney, it's still quite expensive. If it's just a couple of kilometres, it's still several dollars out of pocket that people justify still continuing to drive rather than using public transport. So I think this would be a great campaign to keep pushing in the lead up to the state election. And equally with public housing, it's not just about more public housing, but, you know, the number of housing pathway forms I fill out every week, that the absolute appalling state of existing public housing and how so much more needs to be invested in keeping in maintaining them, upgrading them, you know, and often it's young families, it's people with chronic diseases, people with severe mental illness. They're the ones that are most affected and whose situations, their health particularly, are actually compounded and worsen because of the state of the living conditions that they're in. So, yeah. Oh, sorry. Hi, my name's Aingaran, and I'm from the Tamil community. Thank you.
Other questions or comments in the room?
I just say something quickly to. I went this morning. I think now the tide is changing. Definitely, I saw this very clearly this morning when I went to a protest in front of the Hilton Hotel, where all the big bankers were meeting, and we had a protest there with 350 and XR. And the difference, well, first of all, we had SBS there and much more media who were interested in what we are doing, which, I mean, I've been to lots of these sort of things, these protests, and there was, most of the time, there was no one at all. And also the public, the people around us in former times, most of the people were angry that we were standing in the way, that we were making a lot of noise or whatever. And this time it was totally different. Everyone, so this was great that we were doing that. So there's really a change there now. And I think we have to use that in any possible way.
Rob Carr online. Rob, would you like to make your point to comrades and friends? Maybe not. All good. Is there anyone else on the floor? Okay. If not, we'll go. Oh, hold on. Where is he? Okay, no, it's all right. Rob's in and out. We'll go from Andrew to Paul at the end.
I don't have much more to say, but the one campaign that I spend a lot of my time on now is the Action for Public Housing, and we letterboxed all the public housing areas during my campaign and spoke up a lot about it. And it's really happening. We meet on the third Monday of every month on a Zoom meeting, and we could always do with more people to get involved in that. And we're going to start, a new campaign specifically on maintenance. So we've got that campaign's got defensive characteristics and offensive characteristics. So maintenance is more defensive, but on the offensive, we're like, here's a vacant site, let's build on it, and let's advance public housing more. So yeah, if you'd like to take a flyer or scan the QR code and get more involved, yeah, please do.
Right, thank you. I guess first, Angren. So within the association, there is a suggested motion from the RPA branch that Westmead is willing to give support. That does state I can't recall the specifics of it now, but does actually make a very strong statement about refugee and asylum seekers that do come to Australia and who are treated horribly. In fact, the health outcomes, especially in mental health, but also in terms of assault, both like physical, sexual, it gets pretty awful in those facilities. I think as health carers, there are members who feel that we should absolutely make a very big stand on that. Yes, and I believe that the RPA branch is drafting a motion to be put forward at the annual conference in August. So yeah, that's absolutely that happening, and I think it is it's kind of telling where even the Libs are seeing this as kind of like a losing issue, that the ALP would still do something so soon and so callous. And I think that's an example of where we should be bullying them hard too. On public transport, so I'm from the western suburbs. I live in Parramatta, and you kind of see this a lot too. There's been over the last couple of years a lot of awareness campaigns about people who utilize buses, actually, who where with the development and spread of light rail through more suburbs, bus routes that would serve those stops are getting cut. The problem is it's kind of clumsy, and instead of adjusting the existing bus routes, you just have places that will not be covered by public transport. And the thing about public transport is the poorest of people utilize buses the most. Buses are the huge gap filler. So now that these gaps are only going to get bigger with the introduction of light rail is actually incredibly worrying, especially with people who are with physical ailments, who are frail, have some disabilities. Traveling further to get to the nearest nearest viable bus stop now will be absolutely crippling. So I think those campaigns are worth a lot of support. In fact, Cumberland Hospital is actually going to get a light rail track put through it. Cumberland Hospital, for those not in the know, is one of the largest mental health facilities in New South Wales. There has been concern from the staff about, hey, we have people who are psychotic who are allowed outside. Do you want what's essentially a small train running through our campus? And the members of the Cumberland branch are also moving on that as well. It's a ongoing issue. And yeah, Steffi, I just want to hear that. I just want to say that's awesome to hear. I'm so happy that that change is really starting to grow momentum, and we should nurture that and let it snowball into something awesome.
Yeah, on the TPV stuff, yeah, I mean, let's hope that Labor do it as swiftly as possible. I understand that there is a Refugee Action Coalition action coming up in July. I don't know if it's announced yet or not. And public transport thing, yeah, I mean, it was really good to see when the train drivers were on strike, that we had those fare-free days. Wouldn't it be great if that was a permanent feature of the demands of the railway workers? Because we can talk about policy as much as we want, but that needs to be backed up by an actual strong union who can make those demands.
Yeah, that's it. Woo. Thanks, Charlie. Go for it, Paul.
Yes, well, I'm in agreement with everyone else. I mean, the rights of refugees has just been trampled for decades, and the political opportunism is just immoral. And we see the ongoing dehumanising of the refugees with this situation. What I would say, platform that we need to establish, and the Labor movement will have a key role in this, and that is overhauling the Immigration Act, and that in itself would provide, and there's, I think, a strong movement amongst our communities for it. We're going to have to take on the ALP. We've seen the economies across the world collapse, and we've seen how fickle it's been with the epidemic, the COVID epidemic across the world. But in this space, the country does immigration. The Immigration Act, the Migration Act, needs to redress those needs for the country, and starting with, as we know, evidence throughout the decades have shown the great contribution refugees have had to this country and to other parts of the world. And mind you, for a large part, for the last 20 odd years, we've seen the imperial wars in the Middle East that to bring about justice for them and their families. And I do believe that the Labor movement has the ability, there's a strong progressive position within the Labor driving that.
Hey, Paul, could you, Paul, your audio is a bit crappy. Can you turn off your video?
And tying them in, change that we see.
Nice. That might help.
Yes.
That might help.
Is that better?
There, thanks. That's
okay.
better. Thanks,
so,
Paul.
Look, just in summary, I'll do a couple of things. The public housing, well, I mean, it's been nothing but social cleansing. Both political parties with the neoliberal ideology have set on a course for so long. And I've got to say, I think this election has shown that for a large part of the younger population, they will never see home ownership. But what they do want to see is public housing, not social housing, but public housing, housing that's in the hands of the people. I despise private ownership as a socialist, and it brings about nothing but the divide of our class, and that is worth fighting for. that is worth getting in the streets, that is worth occupying. And there's been great traditions in the past, as we know. Public transport, well, the socialising of public transport is a must. As socialists, we need to bring it into public ownership. But I'll say this from a Sydney perspective. We've got the boundaries of public buses and private-owned buses that, as far as I recall, has not been redistributed since the 1930s. The boundaries, Ashwell, still. So you had to divide from there, and it's not changed since. The fare-free days, I absolutely agree with the comrade. The MUA, when we've campaigned on the water with Sydney Harbour Ferries, for better, collective agreements, we've just opened up the gates. You see government's hemorrhage then. But Sydney Harbour Ferries is an example. That was sold off. That's in at least, it's all the trickery of words. It's privatised. We need to campaign not just in the boundaries. And it was a good question from the comrade from Parramatta and I think Liverpool, because I grew up in Liverpool, Warwick Farm. So I've never known what public-owned buses are like. They've only been private-owned buses. And all that means is someone is making a quid on public transport, some private enterprise. So it's always add-on money. And who gets it in the neck? The workers, the bus drivers, the maintenance workers, and the public. We have a system that's upside down. But I believe that the stronger platforms around identifying and connecting all struggles together bring about a greater understanding, consciousness for working class people. So when we win climate action, we move to the next point. Like I said, we draw up our list of demands and we nail it to the wall. It might be only simple words, but workers know, and the younger generations are seeing for themselves. I'd hope to think that workers my age and even those that have, retired, realise that what they've been afforded is not going to be there for anyone else. What they've been afforded has not been equal between the sexes. And this is where the ground of change happens. So I'm in agreement fully with the panel, and they were very good questions. We've got a lot of work to do, comrades, but it starts with building a platform that is more radical politically, more radical socially, and more radical industrially.
All right. Thank you, Paul. Awesome. Great contributions, everyone. Look, we've got one more comment here from Rob Carr, and Rob helped organise all of the car convoys during the COVID times against various anti-union corporations. So I'm going to get, because Rob can't speak to it, I'm going to get Charlie to speak that out, and then we'll go to some announcements.
Yeah, sure. So Robert says, hi, comrades. Thanks, Rachel, for putting this together. Sorry, I can't unmute myself in an airport lunchroom for my job. Only thing I would add is that we can't wait for Albo, and we need to build an independent working class agenda, target the corporations directly. It is all well and good to target the ALP and Greens into progressive outcomes, but after all, they represent more of a buffer zone in between the masses and the corporate and capitalist class that run this country. Regular workers typically understand this through their negative attitude towards electoralism. Trust workers and people to take matters into their own hands as they have the true power in the economy rather than diverting our organising into parliamentary or boardroom measures.
Oh, thank you, Robert. Very good. Thanks, comrades. All right, big round of applause for all the panellists. And the really good contributions from the floor. We've got some really good militants in the room. And Yeah, really great contributions. A few announcements before we all clean up collectively and say goodnight. And big thanks to the recording comrades. I think we can probably get rid of this session because it's a bit Sydney